record the comments for you so that you can listen to them later. I'm sure that you all will spend another half hour going back over it. Stephanie, I think that the beginning of your speech is we got a long introduction here about the master plan, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but I think it needs to be a little bit shorter, and you need to say, it's time for us to reconfigure our plan again. You know, it's time to say we need to get back to some essentials that we've abandoned, and we need to change the way in which we're financing this thing. And so get to your policy a little bit quicker, because it does take you a while to get to it. It's almost half your speech by the time you finally get to the argument that you're making for us. You also need an organizational structure here. I could tell where your proposition was. I thought that was fine. But you need to tell us what the supporting points of the argument are. And I can see that there's information in your speech. You've got information that says, look, we've got people who are laden with student debt. We've got people who can't afford the tuition that's going in there. So that's your inherency argument. Now, what's the harm of those kinds of things? Debt slows down people's economic development. Lack of access means that people are discriminated against. For instance, you've got a whole group of, you mentioned that it's people in different incomes and people of different colors and first-generation students who get excluded. That's a bad thing, and it's a bad thing because it's discriminatory and because it has a long-term harmful consequence to the state. So I think you need to just have a declarative statement that says that's what the harm is. You've got the harms in the speech, but you don't have a distinct structural claim that says here's what the harm is. So I'm having to figure out how to put this together instead of you're telling me how to put the information together. And that's why you're the speakers. That's why you're the advocates. You want to kind of move people in the direction of your point of view on this instead of just presenting data and having us say, well, okay, let me take all that data and I'll figure out what it means. You want to make the declarative statements a little bit clearer. Then you've got some more inherency information about how grants and aid have been cut and how we've had to cut a variety of sections and access. That's more of the significance argument because of the financing system that we've had. We had to restrict the number of people who could get into or they've had to delay their getting out of school. By the way, the delay of getting out of school, I think, is an argument that comes up later on the negative side, and I think there's a good response to that particular point. The negative doesn't get as much out of it as they might. So there's a lot of reading that's going on, and here's the other big issue for your position, and you've got a lot of information. I don't hear a source citation for any of it. I know that you're getting this information from someplace, but I couldn't tell you where it is. And I don't doubt all of the data that you have, but if there is ever a question about whether or not it's reasonable you've got this one thing that says groups are all excluded, people of color and income and first generation. That's somebody's opinion. I'm going, okay, well, who is that? Why should I believe this particular person? Isn't it everybody who gets excluded? Why is it this particular group? This is an expert who supposedly knows something about this. I don't know who they are. You never say. The factual data shouldn't be that difficult to believe. That how much fees have gone up in the last 15 years. That's pretty straightforward. 100% in the last 15 years it's increased, or it's the number of the amount of enrollment's gone down 40,000 students in the last year. Okay. I'm sure that nobody's making these numbers up, but again, I think it's probably more credible on your part if you cite the sources on those sorts of things. So I think you've got the right issues here. We do need some information that suggests that changing the tuition issue is going to make a difference. And you've kind of just taken this neat argument and said, well, if the inherency is right, then the outcome would be if we get rid of that inherent problem, then we'll automatically fix those issues. And that's the key argument that the negative comes back on later on. And because you don't really have any information that suggests that this is practical or workable, I think that that gives the negative a little bit of an advantage on that argument. They can point to their example of Louisiana or Germany, for instance, as illustrations of these points where they haven't had that success. And then all you're going to be doing is kind of saying, well, it ought to work this way, it should work this way, because you don't have any solvency information for that particular point. So I see that as being a little bit problematic. All right, Roland, I think you start off pretty well with the responses that you're making. They don't always apply to particulars that the advocates are talking about, but there are a couple of things that are pretty good. So they start off with the master plan, and you come back and says, well, all of these ideas don't always work out the way we think that they're going to work out. And you mentioned that states often do pay for these kinds of things, and then you make the argument that says we don't get the outcome that we want. And here's an example of Louisiana. And I think that that's a good illustration that here's a state where they're doing the very thing that the affirmative wants to do. So now the question comes up. Do people get into college that couldn't get into college before? Do people graduate faster than they did before? Do they get out of college with less debt than they had before? And this is the point where you want to be saying they don't do those sorts of things. Now, you've got some other arguments here that says that talk about the problems that the state has. Those, I think, are disadvantage arguments. In other words, we're going to have tax issues, that there's going to be a deficit, that sort of thing. But the argument that I think that works best for you is this issue about the TOPS program, and at best it got 50,000 more people into school. And you say, and that's not much. It sounds like a pretty good deal, but it's only like one university in our whole system. That's what it would be. That's what the difference would be. And you're trying to diminish the significance and say it's not going to be that much. By the way, if I were you guys, Timothy, when you get back up, I would look him right in the eye, look us right in the eye, and say, okay, well, I'll take his figure. We'll have 50,000 more people in school in California after we put our plan in effect than we currently have. Doesn't sound like much, and maybe it is only one particular campus, but you know what? For those 50,000 people every year, that's a pretty important deal. And all of a sudden, they've in essence quantified, at least in Louisiana, that we got 50,000 more people in. That's a pretty good statistic. You don't have anything at this point about how many more people we would get. And now you've got a piece of information that says, hey, it worked in Louisiana getting 50,000 more people. They think it diminishes your significance, but it gives you a better significance claim than you had from the very beginning. Plus, I think you want to go back. I'm sorry, I kind of jumped ahead because there are a couple of other arguments that you can make too that I think you ought to be making. But let me follow up on stuff that we're talking about with Roland. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself on talking about that issue. All right, then you kind of drop down to the debt issue, which I think is a good argument because they've made this argument about debt as being particularly problematic, and it's one of the barriers that people have, or it's one of the negative consequences. Our system, students have to pay for it, and they have to go into debt for that, and they're saying that's a bad thing. Well, the first thing you want to point out is, even if they do prove that there's debt, they don't show you that there's any harm to that particular debt. I don't know why that doesn't get presented. I think there might be a harm to having all that debt. I think most of us would figure out that having a lot of debt's not a good thing. But don't you think somebody should say it as opposed to just, well, there's debt. Okay, so what? How many of you owe money for a car that you bought? That sort of thing. There's debt. Or you're buying a house. There's debt. Debt is what finances our economy. Why is it a bad thing to have debt for education? If we've paid for something that we think is worth it in the long run, that should be a good thing. That's what we ought to be going into debt for. I think you ought to make that argument because they haven't given you any harm to what that debt is. They haven't shown you that it inhibits people or prevents them from advancing in their jobs or has any consequence. So don't let them get away with it. Now, your response basically is a solvency workability type argument. It could have easily been in the second negative as a workability argument, but I think it fits here, and that is that these kinds of plans don't produce the outcome that they think they're going to produce. And here you've got this example of Sweden where they have exactly what the affirmative is talking about, and students end up with more debt than they have in the United Kingdom and almost as much debt as they have in the United States. So how is providing tuition-free education going to solve the debt problem? It isn't. I don't think debt's that big a deal in the first place, but they think it is, and their plan doesn't fix it at all. That's a good argument. All right, and so I thought that that was an appropriate thing for you to make mention of. All right, and then there's this argument that talks about how, people are, let me see. You've got this statistic, the 81% and the 7%. It's based on, I remember now, it's that the vast majority of people who graduate from college come from, above average or above average incomes, and people who don't come from below average incomes. And your argument is, I think the argument that you're making is that people who are in those lower areas don't really have much chance of getting out of this because they're underprepared or there's some other problem that's going on there. See, if I was the affirmative, I would jump up when I hear that argument and say, yeah, and does that sound right to you, that people can't get through college because they're poor? That's why we need to have this particular issue. That proves the point that we were making, which is that first generation, people of color, people who are poor are excluded from this opportunity. Thank you very much, Roland, for illustrating that point for us. Because you've got a different interpretation of it, but that's exactly the interpretation that I would make of it, that this shows that poor people can't get through the system the way it is currently. That's why we need to change it. So you got to listen to the other side's arguments and ask, well, what is this argument really saying? Because on the affirmative side, I'd be jumping all over this one. That's a perfect illustration of the point that you were making from the very beginning.
I wanted to, but I didn't know I was allowed to.
Why wouldn't you be allowed to?
I don't know. Everyone was keeping to a structure, letting him talk, and I was like...
Well, I didn't mean you should jump up while he's saying it. No, I didn't. I'm sorry, I didn't mean that. Timothy should be getting up and saying, okay, well, he made this argument. That proves our point. Stephanie said that first generation people, people of color, and people who are poor can't get through college. They're excluded from these opportunities right now. And nice of the negative to come along and quantify that. That 80% of the people who do get through college are basically well off, which means that everybody else is screwed. That's why we need to change the system. I think that's the way you want to follow up that argument. And that would have been the second affirmative who makes that argument on that particular point. I think that you've also got another solvency argument that you make here, that there are other factors that are important that prevent people from completing college that have nothing to do with the finances. Typically, those, again, they could be either workability arguments or they could be solvency arguments. You're presenting them as solvency arguments is not a problem. It looks like Keenan had enough to say anyway, so there's not a lot of overlap here, and so it's a reasonable argument. And those other factors are, they're not prepared to go to school. We've got a whole bunch of people who are getting out of high schools who can't do math, they can't read very well, their writing is atrocious, and now you want to pay for them to go to a state university where they aren't qualified to be simply because they are, can't afford it now. That's not a good use of our resources because they're not going to graduate anyway. They're going to spend 5 years there doing remedial math to be able to get to be where they should have been when they got out of high school. This doesn't seem like it's an appropriate way to run things, and I think that's the argument that you need to be making. You kind of make that argument, but it doesn't really go very far there. And then you've got what sounds like it's a disadvantage about employment, that if all these people do that, then there's going to be more competition for jobs and everything. And I don't know that that's really helping you that much. It doesn't get developed very well. And let's come back to what the affirmative might say about these kinds of things. Oh, gee, what a terrible problem. We're going to have a lot more people who are qualified for the jobs that we need to fill as a result of our policy. The negative thinks that's a bad thing. I'm sorry, that's what we think the colleges and universities are supposed to do. Prepare people to do the jobs that the economy needs to have filled. And the negative thinks that's a bad thing. Oh my gosh, I might have a hard time competing for my job because there'll be somebody else who's qualified out there. By the way, and that's mostly an assertion on your part, there's no quantification of who's going to lose jobs as a result. And you're in essence saying, when we come back to this, you should be saying, that means that there'll be more people who are qualified to do these jobs. Businesses will be able to expand that couldn't expand before because they didn't have people. And there's a lot of stuff that talks about why, especially California, we have to change our workforce to reflect the new economy and the ways that things are working. And we have people who aren't prepared for doing those kinds of things. And guess why they aren't prepared? Because they can't get through college that they need to get, that sort of thing. So that's, I think, the way that you should be responding to those particular points. So let me, since we've been talking about the negative on this, I've mentioned a couple of things I think that the affirmative needed to follow up on, Timothy. So that's the first thing that you want to do, is you want to listen to the arguments that the other side is saying and say, do any of those arguments undermine something that we're talking about, or do any of them support the position we talked about? Because like I said, I think there are 2 or 3 things that they've mentioned that support that position that you've got. The one that says, all of the people who managed to get through college are wealthy right now or well off right now. That's the point that you're making. You should be turning that around and saying that illustrates the point. When he says the program in Louisiana results in only 50,000 extra people going to college in Louisiana, I'd be saying, well, at least that's 50,000 people more than we have now going to college, and that's not a bad thing. So I think there are opportunities to develop your significance argument based on things that the negative said on this particular issue. Don't forget, though, that you ought to be responding or paying attention to arguments that they made. So they made a couple of other arguments, for instance, about the tax thing in Louisiana that I don't think you ever responded to. They make this argument about debt, and your response on the debt argument is a little unclear. It's a different economy, and I'm going, well, how does I'll agree that maybe it's not a manufacturing economy anymore. It's a service economy, or it's a government-centered economy. But how does that change the issue about debt? I don't understand. I mean, you have a response, but I'm not sure that it's responsive to that particular point. You need to explain that, and it doesn't really get explained. You just kind of say it. You also kind of start in an odd place. It seems like you started your constructive response on the last things that he talked about instead of starting on the first things that your partner talked about. That's where you ought to be starting. You ought to be starting with your case and say, all right, well, they don't dispute that the California Master Plan is out of date. They don't dispute that we had an economic crisis that resulted in the schools having to close classes, that it impacted both the UCs and the CSUs when the community colleges didn't get financed in the right way. And they don't dispute that we had 40,000 enrollment decline, and that fees have doubled, and that the people who are being excluded are black, brown, yellow, red, purple, green, whatever, all the colors that are being mentioned, and that sort of stuff, and that's a bad thing. So my partner said all those things, and the negative said about those things nothing. So Those things are all still true. Let me tell you why they're the most important thing for us to decide on today. That's kind of what you want to do. Take the arguments that the other side has ignored and tell us why that means so much more. I think that's the way that you're going to build a better argument. And then go to some of these other points that they do make and follow them. I appreciated that you tried to respond almost immediately to something that they said, but I'm not sure that it's the most important things that they said. And then suddenly you're playing on their territory instead of your territory. I think you're better off if you kind of, force the issue back to the position that you've got. On the debt issue, you do come back to the argument, like I said, about why there is, how much debt there is, then that people are graduating with debt. Oh, that was another good argument. A lot of them aren't graduating and they still have debt, which means that they've accumulated a huge liability and they're not getting anything in return for it, and that's a bad thing. That, I think, is a little bit clearer and more understandable. I think you guys needed to develop the debt argument a little bit more as a significance claim, because you just kind of assume that debt in and of itself is a bad thing, but you need to explain why it's a bad thing. Why does it hinder people's progress? Why is it causing some difficulty? One of the arguments that you have, you kind of hint around a little bit, is that people can't finish because of the debt that they have. And I think that could be developed a little bit more as an argument as well. All right, now, Keenan in the second negative, you do have distinct arguments. They're not always structured very clearly, but they are distinct arguments, and I appreciated that. So you start off with the idea that free tuition's a bad idea because there's really no such thing as free stuff, and ultimately somebody has to pay for it. All right, so you've got two examples that you give us, Germany and Louisiana, which is kind of the same examples that your partner used at the beginning, but your focus here is now on what the cost is to the state. And you say in Germany, they've got a 49% tax rate, which means, you know what that means? Explain it to us. What does a 49% tax rate mean?
Their income tax, they take that much away from their...
Yeah, so that means that if you're working for $10 an hour, 5 of that is going to the government. So when people talk about raising the minimum wage, what they're really doing is talking about increasing the amount of money that you're sending to the government. Say, do we really want to live in a place where in order to get free tuition, we're going to take half of everything that people earn, and give it to the government? Because that's what they have to do in Germany in order to be able to afford this. In Louisiana, which has tried to do this, they have the 3rd highest sales tax rate in the country, which means that almost 10 cents of every dollar that gets spent has to be paid in taxes, and that's what they have to spend in order to do this. There are states that have sales taxes of 3%, 2%. There are some states that don't even have a sales tax. I think Oregon is one of those states that doesn't have a sales tax. So in essence, in order to get free tuition for everybody, we're going to have to do this. In California, we already have, Louisiana's the 3rd highest. California, by the way, is the highest. So think about it. We might have to increase that another 5%. So now maybe our income tax rate goes up, plus our sales tax rate goes up 5%. It's like, holy criminy, why am I even working? More than half of the money I make is going someplace else. And I don't get to decide where it goes. And I think that's the argument that you need to make. It's not just that taxes go up. What's the consequence of that? The consequence is that you as an individual are affected in some way. You have less money to spend on things that you would like to choose to spend them on. In other words, the government has decided to spend the money on somebody else's education instead of your deciding to spend it on buying a car, which might employ a bunch of people or make your life easier, buying a house, which is an investment for your long-term security, which benefits you but doesn't, But no, they're saying, no, you've got to benefit all these other people here. And I think there's an argument to be made that that's maybe not fair, that's not appropriate, and it has harmful consequences. So you never really develop that. You just say it means increased taxes. Well, why are increased taxes bad? So you got to have an impact argument to that. right? Your second argument is the oversaturation argument. By the way, that's the last time we hear about the tax issue. So you've made that argument, and then you never bring it up again. They never answer it. When they never answer it, when you get to your rebuttal, that should be the first thing. Let me look at some arguments that I made that they never responded to. I said taxes would go up substantially. What did they say about it? Nothing. So pretty much they're granting that this is true. If this is a bad thing, we don't want to do their policy. Right now, the second argument that you make is another one that they don't say anything about, and that is that the colleges would get oversaturated. And that one you do extend a little bit, because it actually gets extended in kind of a couple of different places. You're going to have a whole bunch more demand for services. More students are going to want to go than in the past. And we don't really have the resources to do that. And one of the consequences is that people, for instance, are competing for classes. So you got a whole bunch of people who are trying to go. We don't have the resources for it, so they don't graduate, which defeats the purpose that the affirmative is talking about. It makes it even worse problem. You know, now we've spent a bunch of taxes to be able to do this, and people still aren't graduating. And I think that's the way you want to present that argument. By the way, you know, your roles are going to be reversed in the next debate, so I hope you guys are listening to these arguments too, because that's going to be something that you could use in your arguments when you're on the negative. And then you make the argument about there's no incentive for people to graduate, and then you've got the story about in Germany the average graduate is 28 years old. Well, that's the average. That means that there's a whole bunch of people who are older than 28 when they're graduating. And 28, what's the average rate that people graduate from college in the United States? What age? 21 or 22? This is like 6 or 7 years extra in college. Holy crammy. And I know, and you, like you said, there's a German word for it that you can't pronounce. You know, it's der Lolligager or der Laziesman. You know, something. I don't know what the phrase is, but it means like, I'm here and I'm just going to take my time to do things. Does their policy prevent that? The only incentive that they have is that you have to maintain a grade average. You got to have a C grade average, because that's their answer to this argument later on. So that's great. You have a C average, but you have a C. I changed my major 3 times. I dropped a bunch of classes. I decided I would just take a couple of semesters off, or I'd just do 1 class each semester or something like that, because I'm not in a hurry and I'm being subsidized while I'm doing this. Is that what we want? Is that good for the economy? Is that the culture that we want to shift to? And that's where I think you need to make some more arguments. But I think it's a good argument to make, but it doesn't get extended very much in the rebuttal. So they didn't answer it with anything except the grade requirement, which I don't think is particularly direct to that point. But then you don't do anything with it in the rebuttal. Now that it hasn't been answered, tell us why it matters. And we got other arguments that fit that way. The one argument that does get developed and answered by the by the affirmative, and then argued about, is whether or not we would lose resources because we have so many more people competing for things. Then you'd have to cut out programs in order to be able to afford stuff. So like sports or extracurricular activities or, particular programs, that sort of thing. So you do make that argument. I think that's a good argument. Your response is a uniqueness argument. We're already losing those kinds of things. So that's not a unique disadvantage. That's happening within the present system. And I think that's a pretty good answer. It's not the best answer, because you want to say that's why we need to have free tuition, so that the choices are being made not on the basis of how many students you can attract, but rather on what's most important. Maybe that's a way to make that argument on that particular issue. All right, so we've kind of gotten through the constructive speeches here. And then the rebuttal issues. Here's what's happening in the rebuttals. You guys are kind of just randomly finding things to talk about, and you aren't necessarily addressing all the things that you're supposed to talk about. So, for example, in the first negative, Roland, you come back and talk about the debt issue. That's not a bad thing to talk about. But you ought to be pointing out that they ignored some arguments that you made, and that you think those are important. I think it's always a good idea. Start with the arguments that you made that they said nothing about. I said X, I said Y, I said Z. They didn't say anything about those things. So those points are still true. Here's why they're really important. Now, on the debt issue that they did talk about, I showed you that you're not really going to change the debt at all, and I explained why. His answer that it's a different economy, how does that change what your debt is? It's still debt, and if debt is a bad thing, it doesn't matter whether you are working for the government or manufacturing something, you still have $28,000 in debt, $50,000 in debt, whatever it happens to be, and they've said it's a bad thing, and according to the research that I presented, people who have free tuition still end up with a huge amount of debt because they have to pay for other things that are going through that process. So you got to say, why did I make this argument in the first place, and how can I show that it is still applicable here? Then you got into some stuff about how we spend the money and how it gets distributed, and that's kind of goes back to the argument that Keenan had made about we're going to have to cut some priorities or make some changes, and it's applicable, but I don't know that you get that much out of it. In the first affirmative rebuttal, Stephanie, you kind of start with some of the other issues that are being talked about. You're back to the debt, to the issue there on how much money we're spending. We've decreased amount of money on the state that the state is spending now. So that's a case argument, and it's not an unimportant argument to make. But Keenan made this argument that says that free tuition is bad because it increases taxes, that the universities would be oversaturated, that it doesn't really solve the problem, or it actually encourages students to stay in school longer, and it hinders their progress in a variety of ways. I think you want to answer those arguments first. That's what your responsibility is for the most part. And I know it's a little confusing because you're always trying to figure out, well, wait a second, who am I supposed to be answering, and that kind of thing. I don't know how to differently explain it than the way I did. But here we have an actual experience here. His arguments are the first things that you should be talking about, basically. So he's the second negative. The first affirmative rebuttal is basically responsible for addressing those issues. And you addressed one or two of them, but there are a whole bunch that didn't get addressed. I do think that you have a good argument, though, that you make that says, look, California is dropping the amount of money that they've spent. We've gone down to being the 45th state when it comes to community college funding. This is not acceptable. This is creating a problem for us. So that is a significance argument that you're extending. That's pretty good. And then we get to the last couple of rebuttals, and it's very random, whatever we're going to be talking about. We get a couple of issues that you're talking about. Always ask yourself, why is it important? Why am I talking about this? Let me explain to you why this is the key issue. And I think that you're missing some opportunities. You always want to be painting a contrast at the end when you're summarizing what's the issue that I've got. Timothy, I know that everybody sees you got a little stuck there in your rebuttal. It's like, I don't know exactly what it is to say. You ever see The Princess Bride? The movie The Princess Bride? Remember what they told Fezzik? Go back to the beginning. When something goes wrong, go back to the beginning. Vincini said, go back to the beginning, so that's what I'm going to do. So go back to the beginning. You get stuck, let's go back to the beginning. What is it we're trying to accomplish? We've got people who can't get into college because they don't have the money. We have people who are in college who have to stop because they're debt-ridden. And we have people who get out of college with more debt than they can handle, and it creates problems for us. That's what we need to change. That's what we're trying to accomplish here. We think that we've shown that free tuition would solve some of those problems. They say, well, free tuition doesn't solve everything. I agree, it doesn't solve everything. People will still have some problems. But it solves a lot of things. It's going to make it easier access for students who currently have no access. Do they ever deny that? No. As a matter of fact, they acknowledge that in Louisiana we got 50,000 more people educated as a result. Always kind of think back, What were we trying to accomplish? Let's go back to that particular argument. So if you guys get stuck on something to say, look back at what has been said in the past and just remind us, here's the point that we're trying to make. Maybe it won't be perfect, but you'll sound more like you are knowing what you're saying and trying to get across an idea than if you're struggling trying to figure, well, I'm not saying repeat everything, but just kind of remind us, here's the point that we're trying to get through. Always remember, what's the point of the argument that we've presented, and then you've got an easier way of finishing off. And I think that that would be what you need to do, okay? Do you guys have questions? Anything you want to ask me about? Do you understand the things that I've explained to you? I mean, look, it's your first time through, and there's always something you're going, what the hell is he talking about?
So in the rebuttal, I was supposed to answer to the first time that Keenan spoke.
Yes.
Well, damn, I had an argument for that.
Yeah.
Oh, all right.
So, it's, like I said, it's sometimes a little bit confusing with all the diagrams that we did and all that kind of stuff. But it basically comes down to the second negative is supposed to respond to the first, the second affirmative is supposed to respond to the first negative in their constructive, and then the first affirmative responds to the second negative in their constructive. And then the last two speakers are basically trying to summarize for everybody. Right?
Because I was sitting there, listening to him speak, and I had like an entire outline. I was like, I had arguments.
And that's what you should have done, is make those arguments. And then when he gets up to do his rebuttal, his summary at the end, then he's got those arguments to go to. And he can say, Stephanie answered this point. Keenan said this, and he claims that this is still true. But Stephanie gave two answers to that point that he ignored. Our position is valid in that situation. So you got to be listening to everybody else in the debate also. All right. Anything else? All right. Well,